Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide actionable insights and strategies from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we discuss will be immediately actionable and useful to you. And I'd love to hear in the comments for this episode your takeaways and what you're planning on implementing. Today's episode, I'm so glad to be joined by Dr. Kathy Pearson, who is a strategist, systems thinking expert, and authority in decision-making. She's also an award-winning educator who works extensively with mid to senior level executives, including high potentials and executive teams. Her works with executives span a wide variety of industries and geographies, including healthcare, life sciences, financial professional services, technology, consumer products, and many more. And she's also the co-author of the best-selling book and one of my favorite books on the topic, The Perceptive Leader, a handbook for leading in an environment of uncertainty. Thank you for joining me today, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm so honored to be here with you.
So today's focus for this episode is going to be unpacking some of those 10 core capabilities from your book that enables leaders to thrive in a VUCA environment. Hopefully everyone knows what VUCA means, because we are definitely in one today. And I love your book on this topic, and it's really a handbook for leading in an environment of uncertainty, providing those 10 capabilities, core leadership capabilities to thrive. The first 4 focus on decision-making, and the final 6 on managing uncertainty, correct?
That's correct. And they're not mutually exclusive, as we'll find out in our conversation, but we sort of look at sort of both of those levers in terms of looking for good outcomes.
That's great. But before we dive into those topics, I'd love just to pose a question to you at the beginning. And that really is, why do you think decision-making is harder now than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, Charles, when I work with different senior leaders, I hear this all the time from them. That certainly is a perception. Now, we could have a conversation about whether it's just perception and not real or not, but it is absolutely the perception. That was even pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. Now, of course, people are really saying that. Can you imagine? I spend my life helping organizations think about managing uncertainty. This is like the Olympics for me, for goodness sake. But I'll tell you how, highlighting why people perceive this. There's a lot of reasons, but I think one is just look at the global pandemic. I can't tell you how many senior leaders, especially those first few months, were saying things like, I am making decisions without any historical data. Like there's no precedent. So that idea that we are in unprecedented times certainly is one factor. I think organizations are much more complex now, right? So you hear things like, oh, we have consensus-driven decision-making. We have all these stakeholders. Now, one could say we've always had stakeholders in decision-making, but it sure seems like that complexity, that C part of VUCA, is much stronger.
No, I love that, because I agree with you. It's a more complex environment. Not only that, you can't use your past successes to help out with the problems that we're encountering today, which is why I wanted to start with one of the principles for developing and evaluating a range of alternatives. Because there's a bias here by many leaders to consider it a limited set of options instead of a wider set of options, especially today, like you mentioned, where they don't have any past examples or experiences to draw from, correct?
That's correct. And actually, there's the whole slew of what we call cognitive biases. I think 65 or some such have been identified to date. And one of those is what we call the overconfidence bias. We really don't understand the depth of our uncertainty or the depth of our lack of knowledge. And we're hardwired to feel this way. So it's not like we can wake up and say, I'm going to stop being overconfident. I'm going to stop being biased. So we have to think about ways in which we can mitigate the effects of these biases, particularly the overconfidence bias.
I would agree with you. And I love the example in the book that leaders need to become better at reframing where they are in viewing a decision from maybe a new perspective. And you use an example in the book of a CEO of a high fashion brand that I love. If you could just kind of unpack that for our listeners, of just as a demonstration, right, of how a leader should be better at reframing, because he didn't even know what the problem was. He was looking for new business when in fact, that wasn't even the problem that needed to be solved.
That's exactly right. That's a really an interesting example. So this leader, by the way, was in sort of consumer products, but not in the beauty business, if you will. And so he came in and he looked at women's bathrooms, and these were luxury sort of beauty products that the company in which he became the CEO. He had a completely different sort of picture, and he saw that everybody was trying to figure out how do you get that person to spend more money, and he realized, you know what? We want a bigger percentage of her bathroom. It was a really interesting sort of way to look at it, because even the most wealthy women, and women are typically the clients, not always, but that they often refer to in this company, the consumers, as she, that the array of products, even still, even the most wealthiest of women may have some products that aren't necessarily high end because they don't need the high end. So how do you get a bigger percentage of their bathroom? And that's how he reframed it. And it was a different way to think about the consumer. Very consumer focused, by the way. He could do that because he came from a completely different, related, but a completely different sort of viewpoint.
Well, that's why with some leaders, right, when they're coming into a new industry, they bring new insights and not the same way of thinking, so that groupthink is eliminated, or they might play off of some of their strengths, some of their experiences and expertise in other fields that can overlap and bring a fresh, new, creative slant or perspective to the problem.
It's interesting when I work with an organization, with a single organization, and let's say I have 70 more senior level folks from one company, I often say, how many of you have been with this organization for more than 10 years? And if more than 80% of them raise their hand, that's an indication to me. It's an indication probably that it's a great place to work. It's an indication to me they have a good retention policy. It's an indication that this company likes to promote from within. And it also means that these folks at their level, their peers, they've all had this similar experiences professionally. And so I encourage people in that situation to, hey, go out and either bring people into the organization. Not if your policy is to promote from within and that's your culture, I get it, but maybe you need to bring some, or at a minimum, make sure those senior leaders are going out and building a network outside the organization for exactly what you just said.
Yeah, you really need to seek diversity of thought because that really helps to make better decisions. So that first example really showed that a leader needs to become better at reframing where they are in viewing a decision from possibly a new perspective. Now, leaders, another aspect of this is that we're really not, like you said before, we're not very good at understanding what we don't know. We are not good at knowing the depth of our ignorance. So
That's
overconfidence bias, you said, plays a partial role in this. And it's demonstrated through the Deepwater Horizon case, right? That oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, the CEO said, we're pursuing this one alternative. It's going to fix the problem. Guess what? 4 months later, it didn't fix the problem. It grew worse than they ever imagined or expected. So it's really not looking at it. It's bringing in diversity of thought, right? And looking at it from different perspectives, which you state in the book, and I love this other book that you referenced, Decisive, how to make better choices in work and life. And they discuss a technique called multi-tracking, because they found that, believe it or not, out of the people that they surveyed, 168 leaders, the decisions that they made across the organizations found that only 29% of them considered more than one alternative. That's really shocking.
It's crazy. The whole BP oil spill is quite fascinating. By the way, Charles, I don't know if I told you this, but I'm literally sitting on the Gulf of Mexico right now. And so it's near and dear to my heart. My family's had a place on the Gulf of Mexico. I remember it very, very well. And, that's a perfect example. You may wonder why we don't have case study upon case study about it. Well, listen, we get lots of different perspectives. People are telling all sorts of different stories on what exactly happened with the decision making. But you're right. We know at least some of it. And it was very, very narrowly focused. This happens often. In the book, we talk about what we call experiential frames. We've been sort of referencing that idea that we look at the world based on what we've seen in the past. Naturally, that's what we do. And then that overconfidence bias, you put those two together, and someone who has deep expertise and deep knowledge can often fall into that trap and say, listen, I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot. I've seen everything. And I know this one alternative is what we need because I know what's going to happen. And that's where leaders get into trouble for sure.
No, and that example, the Deepwater Horizon, is a great example of that. And in the book, I'd love for you to unpack a technique where we can have more diversity of thought So it's called multi-tracking to identify a wider range of options, which would have helped in the Deepwater Horizon case for sure, and many other cases where, like you said, our experiential frames, what we've encountered in the past, limit our solutions moving forward and what we think will work.
Yeah, so this idea of multi-tracking, thinking about what could happen, what different alternatives could happen, you try to, some people will say, "Hey, Kathy, how many alternatives are enough alternatives?" And it's not necessarily the number, it's the width, it's the range, right? And so that idea of saying what really could happen, and it's, to be fair, sometimes you get people that's in scenario planning, for example, that kind of go off in this, what if aliens come down from Mars and take over our company, right? Like these really way out sort of a global pandemic, for example. Oh, that's right, that can happen. I forgot about that. That idea. But so the real extremes can be kind of ludicrous. But how do you push out in a way so that you can multi-track different possible scenarios and say, aha, now I'm seeing early indicators of which way this thing is going. Really, but it takes a leader who is interested in hearing other perspectives and learning about them and considering perspectives outside of their own experiential frames.
And one way to do it where you could take different teams that examine it from different experiential frames, right? So one could be a financial frame, one could be a sales frame, another could be an operations frame. And then you look at particular areas of root causes. So the root cause could be
That's right.
people, it could be the process, or it could be the culture within the company. And then you look at it in terms of scope as well, a very broad scope, a very strategic focus, or maybe a very detailed. So, it's a great way to structure the process so you bring in different diversity of thought, experiential frames to benefit from the decision or to benefit the decision-making process.
That's right. Absolutely. And I think that it's not only those functional area, for example, in organization today, but people who I can't remember but to be honest, whether we talked about these six thinking hats. That's a very
The
popular,
Bono's six
yeah,
thinking
the
hat,
burner
right?
six
Yep.
thinking hats, where you say, listen, you're going to wear the black hat, which means you're going to be the devil's advocate. You're going to wear the green hat, which means you're going to be the one who has all these fresh ideas, and so you assign these hats. And that also, by the way, one of the things that helps do is to develop people, their skill set. So if I'm naturally sort of that sunny optimist and I'm always thinking, out of the box, well, maybe I should be the one who sort of has to be able to make my argument with numbers. So I have to wear the red hat or whatever color it is, right? So I think that's another way to look at it. It's all about fostering different perspectives, different ways to look at a particular problem, not only for the framing, but for solutions, for those range of alternatives. So it's the framing of the problem, but it's also those range of alternatives.
And doing it in a deliberate manner, right? Because we default to what we're more comfortable with, and we don't
That's right.
look at those alternatives unless it's done deliberately and intentionally, like with DeBono's thinking hats or with the multi-tracking. So you set that structure up as part of the decision-making process.
Yes, and it's interesting you say that the sort of that disciplined approach and a structure. So often I work with, if I'm working with, for example, physicians, scientists, engineers, people who are naturally sort of analytically driven, financial folks. This whole, oh, sort of let's do whiteboard and kind of come up with these ideas and what could it be? That is not very productive for those kinds of folks. Give me a structured way to get different perspectives. Now I'm in, and yeah, I'm an engineer by training, so I appreciate that. I'm not so good. Sort of some people very very creative can sort of think out of the box, but that idea of putting a sort of a structure to it is very appealing to a lot of people.
Even the company IDEO has that same structure, even though they're very
Absolutely.
loose with that to build that creative thinking, right? It's some people think that to be creative, to think out of the box, you don't need the structure, but when in fact, in many cases, it supports that creative process, that creative decision-making process.
Absolutely. I do some work with Google, and I'm not saying anything out of school here, but I think most people have heard, or some people have heard of their 20% rule, where supposedly 20% of your time is supposed to be outside of your area of responsibility. But, and so when I talk with Google folks, there is a conversation about, and yet we need to be focused in some ways. If it's just completely unstructured, then maybe we're losing sort of that intent. So it's a balance always.
When you spoke about this before, is what if you have too many options, right? You want options that are plausible. You don't want those far-fetched ones that just don't seem like a reality, like the aliens have taken over the company or something that's just
Right.
kind of ludicrous. But what if you have too many options? What ideally, or a ballpark figure, what's the ideal number of alternatives that they're looking for? Is
Yes.
there one?
I don't know that there's an optimal number. And, I would love that because I'm a numbers gal myself. It's interesting, Charles, and I believe very strongly in this, especially as people continue in their career in higher positions. Judgment comes into play. So I think it depends a lot on, what exactly, what the situation is, how many alternatives you have. It's the same thing, just even looking for diversity of thought, which is a huge deal. You want to get different stakeholders' opinions, right, on what to do. But yet at some point you have to have the discipline to make a decision because you can get diversity of thought forever. It's the same thing with alternatives. So I don't know if there's a number, but I think that it's this sort of judgment that says, I have gone out of my comfort zone. I've gone out of what I would have put as the boundaries. I would have bounded this problem as this. We've gone outside of that enough. And now we need to move forward and make a decision, which is really when that managing uncertainty piece comes into play, I think, really important.
Great. And I know that you mentioned this in the books. I'd love for you to unpack how can establishing decision rights help in this manner?
Yeah, that's exactly that whole area of decision rights. Now, if you Google decision rights, you might come up with 50 different sort of techniques and very complex, matrices, et cetera. I think of decision rights as really two things. One is two sort of factors. One is, are you clear about who's going to make the final decision? And that's a big darn deal. I just finished a 3-month strategic planning project with an academic institute. And when I initially began the project, and by the way, the executive director, she wanted to come up with 5 or strategic objectives over the next 5 years. That's good strategy, right? Strategic planning. She wanted to get lots of stakeholder input. I said, that's great. You want diversity of thought. But I told her, somebody's going to have to make the decision, though, because when you ask for diversity of thought, by definition, you get diversity. And somebody's going to have to make the final decision. Is that going to be you? Is it going to be a small group? And she said, I'm comfortable making that decision. I said, good. And so therefore, when we went out to all of these stakeholder groups, we said up front, now listen, she's going to make the final decision. We're getting all this input and it's so valuable that you're doing this. And she's going to make the final decision. People were like, okay, got it. And then the second piece is to put a date on it. Listen, we want to come up with these final strategic objectives by November 1st or whatever the date is. And clearly you could continue to get more diversity of thought. We felt like that was enough time. We looked at the span of people that we were interviewing and getting information. And so that decision rights puts, once again, a structure to this process. If you don't do it, especially if it's a tough decision, people will just kick the can down the road, as they say, right? And you'll never make that decision.
I'll put some parameters and structure around it and really answers that prior question. What are the optimal number of alternatives? Well, depending on the time that you have, and the number that you get during that time will dictate, okay, here are the number that you're going to choose from. And someone's been delegated now to make that decision, which I think is so great because then you don't have paralysis by analysis, right? And you just keep going over alternatives and you never act on anything because you're always going to have to manage some uncertainty. You're not going to be able to eliminate it entirely.
And I think of senior leaders with whom I've worked over the last ever how many years at this point, I would say there's 2 issues or 2 sort of challenges that really keep senior leaders from actually being able to pull that trigger and make the decision. One is just, hey, I want to get just a little more information from one more stakeholder, like trying to get just not understanding you have to move forward at some point. And the second is the uncertainties, just getting paralyzed by uncertainties, which I think in the book, actually, my husband, who is a co-author, the historian in our family, talked about Washington, General George Washington, and how he became paralyzed in sort of this first battle. And he had to finally say, I have to move forward, even though I have uncertainties. It's really important. You see it all the time.
We're going to unpack that example later in this episode a little more in depth, but I love to look at the historical example that your husband provided for this leadership principle, which was the current war, which has now been made into a 2017 historical drama inspired by the competition between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse over which the electric power delivery system would be used in the US. Edison wanted to use direct current. Westinghouse with Tesla wanted to use alternating current. And Edison ultimately didn't win on this. He failed. And it was because of certain things that his hubris, his short-sightedness, his experiential frames, right, about what worked in the past was really a cost to him, was a weakness that prevented him from seeing the advantages of this new system and embracing it.
That's right. That's a great example. And by the way, I can't talk the technical details. I'd have to have Greg here with me. So I can't talk about the merits of AC or DC, but I think it's a really relevant example to organizations and how people interact in organizations. So, Edison was kind of like the grandfather of electricity, and he for years he was the guy. And all of a sudden, this Tesla fellow, Nicholas Tesla, comes along, university trained. Edison wasn't, by the way. He hadn't, just from he had just developed all of this because he was a great thinker and inventor. And this young whippersnapper, if you will, comes in and he starts, working with Edison and wants to suggest all these different sort of ways in which to use electricity. And so here's Edison. Edison is just like the rest of us. He has these biases that we all are sort of born with. He's experiential frames. I'm the granddaddy, by the way. I know electricity, and overconfidence bias. Don't understand what I don't know. But the third piece of this, which I think is really harder to kind of capture, certainly quantitatively, but this guy Tesla was kind of an abrasive sort. He was sort of the one who kind of came in and thought he was the smartest guy in the room. And so here's Edison, who is, someone who's very senior, and I have so much experience. You can see it in an organization, right? You got some Yahoo coming in here, some, millennial Gen Z coming in and thinking he or she knows so much more. And how do you handle that, right? And so Edison didn't handle it very well. Tesla left, and then the rest is history with that sort of current war going back. And I think that sort of understanding those relationships, I'm a quantitative person. I wish we could just have numbers dictate all the time, but things like that are so important.
Well, right. And what I saw really as a great example of this principle in this historical episode and movie and how it played out in history was that, he just didn't recognize his own shortcomings. He had been preconditioned by all the successes in the past. He didn't want anyone to challenge his authority. So he had that hubris about him that said, my way is the best way. And why? Because it's been successful in the past, and it was limiting his belief of what was possible. So he had a great inventor in Tesla who was, like you said, abrasive. He was young. He had a lot going for him, and he didn't keep him within his group. So Tesla went to the competing team and joined with Westinghouse, and it proved out to be a more profitable venture. And Westinghouse ended up winning because DC, even though it was cheaper and cleaner than gaslight, it was limited in range. It had to be boosted continually to be effective, and it required an expensive wiring infrastructure that AC didn't.
That's right.
So unfortunately, even though Edison will go down as arguably America's most prolific inventor, here was a case where he didn't use insight. He didn't use a beginner's mindset. He didn't try to think outside of his experiential frames. And as a result, he wasn't successful. His plan wasn't adopted. It was his competitors. So,
it's interesting, and I haven't heard about it as much in the last 2 years, only because we've been so consumed with the obvious. But and I know this. The last 5-10 years, sort of a movement in sort of progressive organizations is reverse mentoring, right? So you say, hey, let's get someone who's sort of entry level to come in and sort of partner with a senior person. And it's not just the mentoring the senior person down to the junior person, but let's also recognize what can I learn from this young person, which I think is really, really a good way to combat some of these biases. As I said, it's not like we can wake up and say, I'm going to stop being biased. That's not how it works. We have to put in place behaviors that mitigate the effects of that bias.
No, that's great. It's, so I love this first part. We talked about multi-tracking. We talked about seeking diversity of thought, reverse mentoring as ways to increase your range of alternatives. Because once again, many leaders, and we are by default, not very good at understanding what we don't know.
Right.
So use some of these tools we've given you today in this episode. I hope our listeners will use at least one of those. And now I'd like to move to one of the leadership skills that focus on uncertainty. And I think it's one that's critical in today's landscape, and that's scanning the external landscape, because we need to distinguish, which you make very clear in your book, between the known knowns, the future certainties, as well as the known unknowns, the future uncertainties. And we'll talk briefly in a few minutes about the unknown unknowns, but that's separate. So which one between the known knowns, they are your future certainties. You know it's going to happen in the future, maybe not when, but it's going to happen. And the future uncertainties, the known unknowns. You know it's going to happen, but you don't really know when. What should we plan for and which one should we manage?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel really strongly about this. First of all, just sort of the connector between those,
Perfect.
the overconfidence bias means that we don't understand what we don't know. You can't manage uncertainties if you don't acknowledge the uncertainty. So that's kind of the connector in many ways, right?
I agree.
So that's why I've this scanning the external environment says, hey, you can't be it is counterproductive to say I can't make a decision because I have uncertainties. You'll never make a decision. You want to be able to acknowledge those uncertainties as you make the decision. Boy, here are 5 things I wish I knew, but I can't. Those are my uncertainties. And now we move forward and we plan on how are we going to implement the decision. So that's sort of the connector. This idea of known knowns. If you know something's going to happen, whether you like it or you don't like it, you should plan for it. I think in the handbook, an example I give is hospitals in the United States.
And a certain aspect of healthcare, right? Because there's lots of uncertainties with healthcare, the exact cost, new ways to implement the technology, types of diseases we don't even know about that will need to be cured. But you identify there's one certainty that you know that we all know right now, correct?
Exactly. And that's exactly right. And so, there are tons of uncertainty. And this is on the provider side, by the way. So this is the hospital side. And there are many, 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 many uncertainties. Yeah. What is going to be the reimbursement model? We go on and on. But there is something we know over the next 5 years, and it continues. And that is we are moving more and more care from inpatient to outpatient, trying to do more and more care outpatient. It's better for the patients. It's less expensive, right? You get better outcomes. Now, if I'm a hospital, so we know that's a trend. That's a known. I mean, nothing's completely 100% certain, but that's pretty darn certain. And we continue to see it. If I'm a hospital, at least in the United States, I don't like that. I don't like that known because one of my revenue streams is what they call heads in beds, right? The fact that I have the more people I have in my beds. I'm not saying hospitals want sick people, but I'm saying that this is right. But this is a revenue stream, is people staying overnight. But just because I don't like it doesn't mean I don't plan for it. So if I'm a hospital executive right now, I should be, and you can look at hospital systems, across the country are trying to either build their own ambulatory surgery centers, for example, or they have their own urgent care clinics, right? Or they're partnering with organizations who do. Why? Because they're trying to say, listen, we need to prepare, we need to plan for what we know is inevitable. And that's a really, really, really important part of certainly not only decision-making, but implementing decisions.
No, that's great. And I love how that distinction is made and that connection between the last principle and this one, that you are never going to have all of the uncertainties known. The known knowns are the question that needs to be answered, and the direction that it's headed. So why not be more proactive in your approach and plan for it now? The other type is the known unknowns, right? So that it's going to come up, that there are new ways in which technology will be used in delivering care, but you really don't know the answer yet, right? You don't know which direction it's going to go. So that uncertainty, instead of it being that you need to plan for it, you just need to manage the uncertainty. And I love how you say that perceptive leaders plan for the known knowns. What are some of the known knowns that you can plan for now in your job and business? You should know some of those in your job, in your business, in your industry. What are some of those that are coming down, that are going to impact your business, positive or negative, in the future? What are you doing to plan for those? But now let's consider those strategic uncertainties, because those are the ones you have to manage because you can't plan because you don't know which direction. Successful leaders know that they can't wait to make a decision until they're known, because they aren't going to be known in time. But they need to anticipate these. And I love what you say here is so that you can anticipate potential areas of adaptability later in implementation, which I think that's right there, the crux of it, right?
Yeah. A big buzz phrase right now, agility and adaptability. And I think of agility not just as, being flexible, but anticipating where you may need to pivot. And how do you do that? There's going to be things that happen that you didn't anticipate, but we can't anticipate some, and it's going to be in those areas of uncertainty. Suppose I'm a financial advisor today in 2022. If I'm a financial advisor, I know that my clients, whether they're corporate clients or whether they're individual clients, are going to be more technologically savvy in the future than they were in the past. They just took a big leap on average, right? Not everybody, but clients took a big leap in terms of technological capability. I know that. Something I don't know is, especially on the individual side, are my clients going to want to meet in person in the future when we can, if we can? Or are they going to say, hey, that's pretty darn convenient to be able to get on a Zoom call with you. I think we can, right? And now, if I'm a financial planner, I may have a preference. I may have a guess. But to be able to say, you know what, I don't know yet. I don't know for each individual. I don't know what will play out 2 years from now. Will I be doing 60% of my work virtually? Will I be doing 80%? Will I be only doing 10%? I don't know. So if I'm a financial planner, I want to be ready to adapt. I anticipate that I'm going to have to be adaptable and flexible in that regard. I know that they're going to be more technologically savvy. That's not going to be an issue anymore. But it's going to be, what are they going to want? And it's that idea of being able to say, I don't know. Again, I may have a preference. I probably have a preference, and I may have a guess, but the reality is I don't know. And that's the essence of managing uncertainty.
No, I love that. And how can an organization become more adaptable, right? Because those known unknowns, you have the question, right? You just said you don't know if they're going to want to meet in person or not, your clients. So you know potential directions, right? Potential courses of action. How do you become adaptable regardless of the decision or their answer, right? So that you can position yourself appropriately regardless of what they pick.
And you know that what a great question. And all you know what I'm telling people now? About 2 years ago, I just saw it. I saw most organizations be adaptable. Like they never ever would have thought they could be adaptable, right? I mean, those first few months of COVID, and that was an unknown, I would argue, right? That came in. I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but once you said, oh my gosh, this thing just happened. And I know that it's going to have an impact on how we work with our clients, our customers, our patients, our students, with one another, with our vendors. I don't know how, but organizations that performed well in this global pandemic were the ones that said, you know what? We're just going to have to be experimental. If it doesn't work, do something else. And so now I'm hearing a lot of senior leaders say, we're slipping back into the bureaucracy. How do we no longer can we say, well, we could never be that adaptive or that agile in this organization. We just were. And so how do you take what happened? And so I'm really encouraging senior leaders right now and anybody in an organization to sort of reflect on what happened. I know we're tired of talking about the pandemic, but I do believe there are lessons to learn on what happened, both good and bad, that we can take forward.
I would completely agree with you. And there's lots of examples that we can look at through the pandemic. One that comes to mind is Best Buy, how they were able to adapt their model when their stores closed. So the curbside service, and there's a great interview with the CEO of Best Buy on YouTube right now that really she explains the process and how quickly they had to adapt if they were going to survive. With that being said, though, there's some corporations that have made long-term commitments that make them inflexible, not easily adaptable when a disruptor comes into the market and changes how delivery is made. One example that's a Harvard case study is Trader Joe's and how they disrupted that market, which is not seen as a very profitable market if you look at the various metrics, and how the current competitors in that market weren't able to adapt quick enough to really prevent that threat from occupying larger and larger market space within that market. So for those that have become somewhat inflexible by prior commitments, does this speak against that to say you really, if you want to be adaptable, you really you need to be careful which long-term commitments you make and what sources of inflexibility you have so that you can pivot quicker if disruptions of the market happen?
You know, it's interesting. And yes, and it's hard to talk in generalities in some ways, but I think you gave some great examples. And I think of it in some ways, if you think about your personal financial portfolio, for example, you want some of those, blue chip stocks or steady Eddie, you're going to stick with them. It's going to be for the long term. And then you want to have some sort of riskier, opportunities that are maybe higher risk, if you will. And I think that if you have a client, if you're a financial planner, for example, you have a client who doesn't want anything but very, very, very long term, and that's all I want to stay in. Well, that person actually put all their eggs in one basket, if you will, and could quite actually be fairly vulnerable. So it's the same idea, especially when you're in an environment of great uncertainty, which I think we are right now. So yes, you may have, as an organization, you may have some sort of initiatives, if you will, or investments that are longer term, but you want to make sure that you have some funding available, some resources available for that adaptability. I believe that strongly.
I think that's very important. You're right. So we've talked about two of them. We talked about the known knowns, where you can identify the key question and you have the answer to that question. We've also identified the known unknowns, where you can identify the right question, but you don't yet have the answer. So you have to be adaptable so you can implement the right course of action. I'd like to talk briefly about those unknown unknowns. I mean, that's been popularized by Rumsfeld back in the 90s when he said that and brought up that concept. And a lot of literature now talks about those. So this is what you don't know. And I love the quote that you gave at the beginning of that chapter, right? That really speaks to it, by Mark Twain, which I think is great. And maybe you can help me out with. But I'd love to talk about that, and how do you can't plan for them, but how are you better able to predict them?
It's what I know that ain't so. I can't remember the first part. But what I'm just sure I know that really isn't true, right? By definition, unknown say, that's sometimes we call them black swans because of this book called The Black Swan Theory. It's, these events that are very rare and unpredictable. So I do a lot of strategic planning, and I actually encourage senior leaders not to spend so much time on trying to identify unknown unknowns, because the point is we can't know them. They're rare, they're unpredictable. However, I do believe if an organization builds that vigilant capability, and what I mean by that is an organization that's intellectually curious, that looks for early indicators of change, not only relevant to their particular uncertainties, but just in general, those leaders, if you build that capability, then maybe you'll see that unknown just a smidge before your competitors. I remember, and you'll appreciate this because I know you spent time on the West Coast when I was first married, and I promise I will make this short, but it was 1989, and there was the big earthquake in San Francisco. We were living in Monterey at the time, my husband and I, and we had a big dog named Ben. He was a yellow lab. And after the big earthquake, we had many, the smaller earthquakes afterwards. What do we call them? The aftershocks. About a second before we'd have an aftershock, Ben would sit up and look around. It was like he saw it right before it came. We didn't know when these aftershocks would happen, but Ben could see them. He had that capability, or he could feel them. He had some way that he knew that an aftershock was coming. And I think it's the same thing. There's a great article called The Business Case for Curiosity, and it was in Harvard Business Review 2018 or 2019, that talks about how important it is to build this capability around curiosity, both with your leaders, senior leaders, and throughout the organization. And it's because of that vigilance.
I think that's great. Having that vigilance to identify those precursors, those harbingers before, can make all the difference. And the quote by Mark Twain, which I think really encapsulates this, is it ain't what you know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so.
That's it. Yes, great. Exactly.
I love that quote, and I think that encapsulates that whole concept perfectly. So the historical context that you put this in, or your husband put it in, was Washington, General Washington in the Revolutionary War. He learned from his mistakes. He identified, so the first big battle was the Siege of Boston with General Washington. He faced some certainties, or some known knowns. The British Army was larger, it was better trained, the British Navy was the best in the world, and his army would abandon their posts if they were static. So General Washington was able to plan for these certainties. However, General Washington was also faced with the known unknowns, right? The strategy of the British Army in the battle around Boston. He and his advisors were somewhat paralyzed by this uncertainty, and as a result, the British forces got the upper hand. However, after the Siege of Boston, Washington learned what needed to be done and to be more proactive, even in the midst of uncertainty, which was critical because his indecision with little movement caused a loss for the U.S. forces there, or for the Continental Forces. So he had to become more adaptive as a leader, right? To eliminate the unknowns completely was impossible. So he appointed someone, General Nathanael Greene, to lead the American forces in the Southern arena. And I'm drawing this out of your book, Kathy, and then I'll let you speak and kind of unpack this a little bit more. But Greene knew how to leverage the Continental Army's strengths and weaknesses to exploit General Cornwallis of the British Army, who had a strong experiential frame, getting back to those frames, about what traditional warfare should be and was like. Greene's leadership in the Southern Theater was essential for the eventual British defeat. And then finally, at the Siege of Yorktown, Washington was able to learn more about his unknowns. And most importantly, he converted them to knowns.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that summarizes again. Now, if Greg were here, he would tell you all about. And Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene's kind of an interesting character, as I recall. He came up as a private, so he was somebody, he knew what to do on the ground, but he didn't come in as an officer or anything. He came in really understanding the field, if you will, and I think that helped him. And I think General Washington maybe saw that, and so I think Nathaniel Greene, even sort of some what we might call guerrilla tactics now. It was not that traditional. See, he sort of had a different way. He was very adaptable because he had to be. You know, when you think about adaptability, I mean, you can think of the battlefield. That's why we take so many management lessons from the military, because at least in a battlefield condition, soldiers have to be adaptable. You have to be, because it's your life depends on it. And what is it that Mike Tyson says? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the nose, right? So you can have a big battle plan, and all of a sudden the battle begins. So I think that a couple of things with Washington, you're exactly right. I think he learned a lot. He just got paralyzed by the uncertainties. I mentioned that earlier, that senior leaders can get paralyzed by the uncertainties. And I think he realized you have to act. You must act. And so he was good at planning for his known knowns. I think for those known unknowns, I think he sort of, when he tapped Nathaniel Greene, I think he knew this is the guy. He had also been sort of in charge of logistics, I think, at Valley Forge. And so he had really knew a lot of what was going on the ground and knew how to be adaptable. And I think that was really smart on General Washington's part, and trusting him as well.
No, I love that example. And I think that example is played out in the movie, not going back to Hollywood, but The Patriot with Mel Gibson, on how it was very formulaic on how the British Army, which were better equipped, better trained, larger, how they fought battles. So if you could disrupt that in any way, ambush them, do things that they didn't expect, because in open warfare, they were going to beat you probably 10 times out of 10. If in an open field, they lined up and they shot back and forth, they were going to beat you.
They were larger and they had better equipment. That's exactly right.
So that's a great way to take that adaptability lesson in your leadership as well, to identify those areas in which you can be more adaptable by not only knowing the known knowns, but also the known unknowns, and trying to account for them and make it less and less uncertain, up to the point which you have to make a decision, because those uncertainties are never going to go away.
And I think we're even seeing this, we're watching this, the Ukraine situation, and it's the David and Goliath situation once again, this supposedly well-trained Russian army and this little upstart. And I think hubris, overconfidence, we're going to march in, and they're going to, and we can talk for a long time why the Ukrainians have been able to, hold off the Russians. We'll be studying that, I'm sure, from all sorts of angles for a long time. But I think, one of them is, when you're desperate and scrappy, man, you can become adaptable. When you know that you are completely being overtaken, you have to be adaptable, and you have to think of other ways, not the traditional ways to do battle, if you will.
I was hoping then, before we close the episode, if we could just kind of go through a case study or just an example of these principles in action. Love to give our listeners just some insight into ways they can apply it, or how it's been used, so it makes it easier for them to apply on their own.
So, it's interesting. I have to tell you, it's not a case study about a particular company, but rather sort of looking for early indicators.
Great.
So in the last 10 days, I have had 2 in-person engagements. One was with a group of physicians who are in the echocardiology field. So the ultrasounds, basically. So physicians, and then 3 days with senior leaders in insurance, completely different. But both of these industries, if you will, really concerned about artificial intelligence. How is artificial intelligence going to have an impact on our profession, our industry? And we've been talking about this for a long time, but I think that technology was so accelerated in the global pandemic that I think it's become really real now, right? And I told both groups and had a conversation about both groups that there's an early indicator. I think that are a source of looking for early indicators, because we often think, okay, well, let's go and see what Google's doing in artificial intelligence, or what Apple's doing in artificial intelligence, or maybe what China is doing in artificial intelligence. And I told both groups, because artificial intelligence came up in this big way, that back in 2019, I think it was, pre-pandemic, I was in Dubai in the UAE, and I met someone from the Ministry of Artificial Intelligence. So here, this country, UAE, United Arab Emirates, a very wealthy country, by the way, that is so investing in artificial intelligence that they have designated, built, developed a Ministry of Artificial Intelligence. It sounds like something from Harry Potter, right? And so if you go and if you Google Ministry of Artificial Intelligence, UAE, this is their mission. We will transform the UAE into a world leader in AI by investing in people and industries that are key to our success. If I'm concerned right now about artificial intelligence, if I'm a physician who reads diagnostic tests, if I'm an insurance company and underwriting and all sort of, are people going to be replaced? How is AI going to be applied? Maybe I don't look at what Google and Apple are doing. Maybe I start watching what UAE is doing. So in other words, early indicators of change. It's not enough to say, I know it's an uncertainty. What's happening in other industries? What's happening in other countries or markets? We tend to be Americocentric, especially in the US, I think. And yet here, I have never heard anybody say, wonder what they're doing in Dubai about artificial intelligence. And I think if it's a big issue for my industry, I'd be watching that website, what's happening with the Ministry of Artificial Intelligence.
Well, that's great. They're making it a priority. They're putting some structure around it, and they're really focusing on it. Kind of like what Miami has done with the cryptocurrencies throughout the pandemic.
That's right. And that's a great example as well, right? And so, who thinks to look at the city of Miami about cryptocurrency? Well, maybe we should, right?
And it's a deliberate effort on the part of their leadership in that city to say, we want to be known as the hub of this, right? So it's having that deliberate strategy, being proactive, looking for those harbinger zones and saying, this is going to be big. We want to be at the center of it, or we want to have a plan moving forward with it. So we're not reacting to the latest developments, but we're more proactive in our approach.
That's exactly right. I mean, artificial intelligence is great. The entire conversation, both with the physicians and with these insurance executives, it was about, we're going to get disrupted. We're going to, instead of saying, how can we embrace artificial intelligence? Let's ride that. Let's take that threat into an opportunity. But you have to be proactive to do that. If you're reacting, then it's a threat, not an opportunity.
Great stuff, Kathy. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As we end each episode, we like to have kind of a call to action. So, Kathy, I ask you, out of all the tips that we shared, is there one thing that leaders should do first to improve their decision making? What's one simple thing they could do tomorrow to say, if they just did this, it would move them in the right direction?
Have the structure and the discipline to actually make a decision. Understand that you're going to have to make decisions under uncertainty. And so try to identify those uncertainties, but move forward. Don't get paralyzed by uncertainty.
So identify that who, put a time frame around it, get alternatives, identify some diversity of thought, key contributors that can bring in some new and exciting ideas. But you're right, provide that structure. So important. Well, thank you for joining me today, Kathy. Remind our listeners how they can get in.
Yeah, so website, elslearning.com. That's elslearning.com. And my email is kpearson@elslearning.com. Of course, and I'm on Twitter and certainly on LinkedIn. Thank you, Charles. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. This concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, it can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and also can be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know that makes a difference, but what you do consistently.